Hi everyone, and welcome back to ThursDev. My name is Luke, and today I've decided to expand upon a concept that I touched upon briefly in some of my older videos, but never really got very far in depth about. To some, this is going to be sort of a game design 101 video, and any game designer will probably already be aware of the principles that I'm talking about today, but even with that in mind, I find that despite being one of the central and most important parts of any game design, it's something that often gets overlooked, or even worse, ignored in the ultimate process of game design. When a designer first sets out on the long road of converting a nebulous game concept into a workable and implementable design, one of the very first things that they need to do before laying down the framework for a single mechanic is to define what are commonly known as design pillars, pillars of gameplay, or just plain pillars. In simple terms, a design pillar is a concept used to describe the primary, fundamental design concepts that the game should fulfill. They're the main underlying points to the game's design, and when done right, should also be the support upon which every single mechanic in the game is built. They're an aspect of the game that will be created, the central themes of the game that need to be addressed, supported, and designed around in order to create a cohesive game project. Once defined, they also serve to become the game's design roadmap, defining what should or shouldn't be a part of the game on the whole. Though in theory creating design pillars is a simple concept, the actual execution is not always easy. Each pillar needs to be both a platform upon which the design is built and a chain to which the design is tethered. What I mean by that is that once a game's pillars have been established, they should be the basis on which you create your designs for both defining what should be added to a game and also what shouldn't. Let's look at a practical example. Let's say that we want to make a good old-fashioned beat-em-up in the vein of Double Dragon or Final Fight. It's an awesome and well-established genre that has a fair amount of wiggle room, so it should be fairly easy to define what we want our pillars to be. Our first pillar, of course, should be arcade-style, three-dimensional belt-scrolling beat-em-up combat. I know it's a big mouthful. Still, this describes really the central mechanic of the game. The player will fight their enemies using martial arts and aren't constricted to a single plane of left, right, and jumping like a platformer. This will provide some design challenges all on its own, but we won't get into that today. For our second pillar, let's say that we want non-linear branching stage progression. Not a complicated pillar, but an important one. The game should allow the player to finish most, if not all, stages in a way that allows them to progress to a different stage depending on how they completed one previous. It defines our level design in a very specific way, which will help to zero in on the way that we plan our progression. The pillar should also be one of the main contributing factors to replayability. And for our third pillar, since I believe that the rule of threes applies very well to game design, I'll say local and online multiplayer should be our third pillar. If we're lacking in a network programmer, we may have to drop the online part, which would suck, but for the sake of this exercise, let's assume we at least have the resources we need for the project at hand. Now, multiplayer is a simple concept, of course. It means that we want more than one player to be able to enjoy the game together, like most old-fashioned arcade games did. We'll probably want a mechanic or two to support that multiplayer, but we can get into that another time. So now we have our three pillars. It's a tidy game concept with a very well-defined idea about what it is that it wants to be. The pillars are also loose enough that we can design around them without being too constricted, in case we decide that we do need to expand upon our mechanics for the sake of game depth later on. The whole point to defining these pillars ultimately is to ensure that we have a cohesive plan as to what the game should be. These don't necessarily need to be set in stone, but if we're going to change them, we should have a damn good reason to do so, and doing so will essentially completely break your game. With these pillars in mind, we know first off that we should make sure that any mechanical design that involves combat should support the martial arts combat that we spoke about. We want to have punching and kicking and maybe a couple of body slams and pile drivers, but regardless, our control scheme should reflect this, as should any combat that we decide to include in the game. It doesn't strictly disclude puzzle bosses, but even those puzzles should be solvable through the application of our character's martial arts. We should also avoid anything in the game that hinders the player from engaging in martial arts action. If we're going to add any secondary mechanics such as character progression or item management, they should be lightweight and not take the player out of our action. Arcade style also means that the game should be mostly self-contained and support quick play. We could theoretically allow saving of game states or level selection mechanic, but Calling it arcade style implies that the player begins the average session at the start of a discrete playthrough, and the player should be able to play from beginning to end in one sitting. The branching stage progression should also not allow backtracking by this logic, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you get the point. As you can most likely see, these pillars are where we should start when defining any given mechanic, and also where we should end up when assessing mechanics' viability. When considering a game mechanic, we need to know where it fits into the overall design of our game and whether it satisfies one of our pillars. If we have an idea for some gameplay feature that we think should be part of the game, we need to make that assessment as to whether it's related strongly enough to our pillars or not, and discard it if it isn't, no matter how much we like it. This sadly is frequently ignored through either poor design or external meddling by forces that don't respect the pillar structure. In a perfect world, of course, the designer will have the agency to use the game's pillars as a bargaining chip, or to dictate when a mechanic deserves to be added if it fits in the game and supports the pillar. And as a designer, it's also their responsibility to rein it in and abort any ideas that don't. And believe me, this is often hard work. Sometimes you'll have what feels like a genius idea for something that should be part of the game, some revolutionary mechanic or cool and trendy additional layer of complexity like collection and crafting, because apparently everything needs collection and crafting these days, but it might just not belong in your game if it doesn't support your pillars. And if it absolutely has to be a part of the game, maybe your pillars weren't strong enough to begin with. But here's the big red warning sign if you're thinking of doing that. If you've already started creating a game based on existing pillars and you're going to change a pillar or add a new pillar, you run a profound risk of unbalancing your game and damaging existing mechanics. Game design pillars should really weave their way into everything in the game and be complementary to one another, or at the very least contribute somehow to the overall experience in a way that doesn't detract from one another. Even something as seemingly innocuous as a collection mechanic. Say that we have items that we want the player to be able to pick up throughout the game, hidden within the levels. Well, through doing that, we already add at least a little exploration to the game that didn't exist before. We do have multiple exits from levels already, be it through actual literal exits or whether the player manages to accomplish something like beating a boss within a certain time frame or not, leading to a different following stage, but either case has now been affected as the player is searching for some collectible, which could mean that they would bypass an early exit or spend more time looking for a collectible and therefore necessitate extending the timing of the achieved stage progression. It also means that collectibles either need to have some redundancy, gathered regardless of stage progression, or need to be persistent across multiple playthroughs. The collectibles also should have a point, and not just be some arbitrary object that we're forcing the player to look for so they'll fill out every entry in a checklist. Without it, the collection contributes nothing to the rest of the game and is suddenly a strange, tacked-on feature that has no tie-in to the rest of the gameplay experience. And that's what our pillars tell us. When we add to a game in a way that's only tenuously related to existing pillars, or is such that contradicts a certain pillar somehow, that's a destructive process known as feature creep, which is a plague that sadly affects a lot of game development. But feature creep is a cautionary tale that I'll reserve for another upcoming video. For now though, in closing, I'd like to reiterate and drive home the point of the pillar. As something that you define at the very beginning of the project, it should inform the design on all levels. It's a tool that will create cohesive design and allow you to easily make decisions on how to effectively design the game. It'll let you define what the game should be on a macro level and help you to avoid the pitfalls of feature creep as you continue to refine and design. No design is perfect and no design is static. Things will always change, but with smartly created pillars, even the inevitable evolution of a project as it develops will allow the evolution to remain non-destructive and keep the game design moving smoothly to implementation. And that's it for me today. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you found this video informative, if not at least interesting. If shiny red buttons are a thing that interests you, there's one down below the video that says subscribe that you might want to click. It'll give you notifications about whenever I upload a new video, of which I do every day, both informative videos every Thursday and Sunday, and lighthearted Let's Plays the rest of the week. Don't feel obligated though, I'm always just happy to see you here at all. Have a great day, thanks for watching, and I hope that I see you again soon. Take care.